The Inquisition swept like a plague across medieval Europe. It was without question one of the darkest and bloodiest episodes in human history. A time when thousands of people accused of heresy by the Catholic Church were arrested, tried, and put to death.
It was ethnic cleansing on a huge scale. It was one faith trying to exterminate another.
There were Inquisition tribunals going on all over the country. It really was a people living in fear.
This religious fanaticism spread to Tudor England, where Catholics and Protestants did their best to wipe each other out. The persecution continued in the 18th century when countless ordinary women were drowned or burned at the stake after they were accused of being witches.
1/3 of the entire population was accused of heresy and witchcraft by the other 2/3.
The Christians were actually aiming to stamp out something that had been in place for thousands of years before them. This was a war on magic and witchcraft, but what it really was a war on people that couldn't fight back.
The world lived in the shadow of Inquisition and persecution for over 500 years. You would think we would have learned our lesson.
Thousands of heretics in this country died under the knife, the axe, or in the flames.
The Spanish Inquisition is perhaps the most infamous of all religious persecutions, and it caused ever greater conflict between Christians and Catholics in Tudor Europe, as we'll see in this episode of Inquisition.
I really don't think you could underestimate how much the Inquisition and the tribunals affected the mindset of the people in Spain.
By the middle of the 15th century, most of Europe was firmly controlled by Rome. The Crusades had been something of a disaster. After 9 attempts to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims spread over nearly 200 years, the Crusaders had been routed from Jerusalem and other key Muslim strongholds, and forced to flee back across the Mediterranean. As a result, the world was now divided into Christian and Islamic lands. Buoyed by the success of the suppression of the Cathars in France, but smarting from the humiliation in the Holy Land, the Pope and his cardinals began looking for new heretics to pursue, who could be converted or executed, not to mention have their lands, assets and monies confiscated. There was one very obvious target: the Jews. So on the 1st of November 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal bull ordering a holy inquisition in the Kingdom of Castile in Spain.
The targets were the new Christians, the conversos. These were descendants of people who'd converted to Catholicism from Judaism between 1391 and 1415, around the turn of the 15th century. There had been a series of riots in that time directed at Jews, and many had either migrated to North Africa or had converted to Catholicism. But they lived in urban areas, and they were an unpopular class among the rest of Spanish society. And because of the discord and tensions between the groups, many of them were thought to be still practicing the Jewish religion and therefore to be heretics, because while they were Catholics and had been baptized, they were not actually performing the Catholic rites as they should have been, and they were keeping other practices, Jewish practices, secret. So the Inquisition was founded as a way of seeking out potential heretics, potential converts or heretics, and trying them.
At the end of the day, the Spanish Inquisition, like all the Inquisitions before it in France, everywhere, these Inquisitions are all about control and wealth. If there's an upsurgent movement, if it's religious, if it's political, they are going to be taken down because they are a threat.
In 1483, Thomas de Torquemada, a Dominican monk, was made the Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition. He opened tribunals which eventually spread across the whole of Spain. The brutal Torquemada became known as the Hammer of the Heretics.
He was most definitely a sadist. He was a Dominican friar. And to be quite honest with you, the Pope set up the Dominican friars, Dominic being, for want of a better word, the first inquisitor. But these Dominicans wearing black habits were, for want of a better word, the Gestapo, the SS of the Catholic Church. And de Torquemada had well over 2,000 heretics tortured and burnt at the stake for heresy. Here's a guy that hated Jews, hated Muslims, and wanted to return the whole of Spain to the true faith, to Catholicism. And here he was, standing at the stake, or standing in the torture chamber, hearing the bones crunch, listening to the sinews snap, hearing the flesh sizzle, and the screams of those poor unfortunate heretics that were being burnt alive on his sadistic orders.
It was Torquemada who really created the new institution. So he was the one who centralized its powers among the Consejo Suprema, the Supreme Council of the Inquisition. He was the one who instituted its processions through the town, its manifestation of its power. That came from Torquemada. And of course, he was also the one who legitimized and authorized the most brutal phase of inquisitorial history. So for all those reasons, that's why he's rightly remembered as one of the most brutal people associated with the Inquisition.
Abajo de las rodillas. Abajo de las rodillas. Delante del Cristo. Hacia abajo.
On March the 31st, 1492, based largely on the recommendation of Thomas de Torquemada and the Inquisition Tribunal, King Ferdinand of Spain issued what became known as the Alhambra Decree, an edict which forced more than 40,000 Jews to leave Spain. Under the terms of the decree, if suspects were denounced by 2 or more persons of good nature, they were investigated by an Inquisition tribunal, and the charge was heresy.
The inquisitors typically announced their arrival in town in advance and expected that everyone attend and confess the error of their ways. Those who volunteered and did so readily, especially to minor misdemeanors, and those who pledged allegiance to the Catholic Church, and especially those who ratted on their friends, well, they were let off easy. However, those who did not readily confess, well, that very fact was used as evidence against them for a much harsher sentence.
Inquisitors would come to town and they would announce an edict of faith. So anybody who had any knowledge of something which was contrary to the faith in their view, the practice of the faith, had to come within 30 days and denounce this to the inquisitors. The inquisitors would then amass their evidence, and then they would start interrogating suspects.
They would arrive at a significant town, they would publish the Edict of Faith. So that was the beginning of a process. They would collect all these denunciations, they would start trials, they would detain people, and they would bring these people to the headquarters of the tribunal. So it was systematically done. They would proceed town by town.
The Inquisitors kept incredibly detailed records of everything that they did. All of the interrogations, all of the sentences, all of the penances. Inquisitors had incredible power over the people that were contained within them, which is why you see people trying to get hold of these registers and to destroy them or to sell them back to the heretics, because they represented the source of the Inquisitor's power, really. So even if you'd been up before the Inquisition and they said, have you had any involvement in heresy? And you say, no, nothing to do with me, I've never seen anything, and then you go away. If it later transpires that that was a lie, they then have a record of you being caught in that lie, and you can be subjected to much more serious punishment. So that they're a very serious source of power. So the Inquisitors don't really need to be particularly brutal, because people understand that merely the existence of these records is enough to give the Inquisitors power over people. People are willing to come forward and to confess things in order to escape serious punishment.
The Inquisition is amazingly efficient, both in the sense that it's good at detecting people with wrong thoughts and it's good at removing them. But by definition, the dream Spain for the Inquisition is one in which it doesn't have to execute or indeed try anybody, because it's got rid of all the wrong opinions.
What we have to understand with the Inquisition and the fear it created in communities is its scope as an institution. So, you know, the great set pieces, like in, for example, the great film of The Name of the Rose in the book by Umberto Eco, is of these very all-powerful people riding into town and wreaking havoc and people being burnt at the stake. That went on. It went on particularly in the 1480s, 1490s, into the 16th century it went on. And it carried on in the minor key, going on through to the 17th and 18th centuries. But what, in a way, was more terrifying for people was the power that the Inquisition could have over their daily lives. So if you were tried and penanced by the Inquisition, a frequent punishment was banishment. You would be sent away from your home community for 5 years, 10 years. You couldn't work there. You couldn't have any contact with your family until you would basically be made destitute.
The first wave of persecution in the last decades of the 15th century was one of the most massive and brutal waves in the history of the Inquisition. So it is Torquemada, but all the other inquisitors were involved in all this procedure. I have no doubt that the Inquisition was feared, and there was a clear impact on behavior.
Ustedes serán calados hasta que sus cuerpos se consumen.
As Inquisition fever swept across Spain, Torquemada's tribunals were soon heaving with thousands of cases and thousands of suspects. Fear was the key. Fear that not being an accuser might lead to being one of the accused. In this poisonous atmosphere of mistrust, the Inquisition thrived. Of course, there were many reasons to report someone to the tribunals, some of them rather less than godly. Some began to realize that it was a convenient way to get rid of business rivals, unpopular family members, even husbands, wives, and mistresses.
The important thing to think about accusations, the way that people denounced one another, there are many aspects of this which made it a really remarkable case of legitimizing and in fact making gossip into a good thing, a noble thing to do. Of course, we all like gossiping about each other, but we tend to feel a certain amount of reticence, or maybe we shouldn't be doing this. But the Inquisition made it into a noble act. In fact, it was a moral duty. If you'd heard some gossip about your neighbour who might be doing something, you had to go and denounce them. That was your duty, and in fact, you could be brought before the Inquisition if you didn't do it.
The whole era was nonsensical, was crazy. All it was, you know, you wanted the cottage that the old lady still lived in. You owed the baker some money. You didn't like the old woman that lived down the road. You wanted to get rid of your wife. You wanted to get rid of your girlfriend. You wanted to get rid of your husband. And so you would make up some nonsensical stories that they would creep out in the middle of the night, and down at the bottom of the garden would be a hare that suddenly turned into a demonical figure and had sex with them at the bottom of the garden. All manner of absolute nonsense that went on in those days. The whole thing was rubbish, was nonsense, but it gripped this country in a way that it's never been gripped before, and hopefully will never be again.
everything which happened within the bounds of the tribunal was secret. So an accused person did not know who their accusers were. When they were trying to defend themselves, they had to guess who it might be. So you will find huge lists of all the people who this person says is an enemy of theirs, in the hope that one of them may be the actual accuser. Which gives a sense of the way in which really what this legitimization of gossip did was to make those kinds of tension and enmities worse, to accentuate them.
Confiesas tus pecados, cuéntanos tus pecados, y serás purificado.
Torture, and the fear of torture, was the real weapon of the Inquisition in Spain. It was the job of the inquisitors to force a confession from those who had been accused. That meant certain death, of course, but many were killed anyway before they'd had a chance to confess.
Te confiesas, nos dices los que has visto, y te puedes detener el dolor.
The Inquisition torturers earned themselves fearsome reputations for the number of confessions they achieved, and they were paid accordingly. A star performer could command a tidy sum as he moved around Spain, pulling off thumbnails and snapping the limbs off suspected heretics.
Confesa, denos los nombres en su grupo.
The torturers travelled with a gruesome array of instruments, designed to apply ever-increasing levels of pain and punishment. Historian and author Richard Felix has studied the use of torture by the Inquisition and is under no illusion about how persuasive it was.
This is actually a wine press, but people were pressed to death. The sentence was that you be taken back from this courtroom to the deepest dungeon, a room where no light can enter, where you will be laid naked on the floor, with a cloth around your loins and weights of iron as heavy as you can bear and heavier to be placed upon your body.
Torture was a threat to obtain confession. We have to keep in mind that all the judicial system after the 13th century, 14th century was based on confession. Inquisition, even the name, the noun Inquisition, reflects this new judicial development of the late Middle Ages. The procedure was organized in the way that at the end they would obtain a confession. The torture was part of these possibilities. It was not enacted all the time, but the threat was there, and so it was an element in the production of confessions.
And of course, one of the favourite forms of torture, fire. Brazier here, branding iron, heated up. You could be branded on any part of the body. One of the favourite things as well was to heat up a metal boot and then put it on someone's foot. Would you recant after that? I think I would. And what about this? This is as bad as it gets. You are actually strapped into this and sat on this chair with these dreadful, huge, rusty nails sticking up.
I think the most resonant form of torture that was used by the Inquisition is probably what was known as the potro. The potro was a form of water torture. You were tied down on a bed which had spikes on it, and then you were bound to it with very tight coils of twine and rope and cloth, which would be tightened with each time that you didn't confess. And then you would be forced water down your throat. And this would happen, the coils would be tightened 6, 7, 8 times. And one of the really sad things about reading Inquisition cases is that it was one of the duties of the scribe to write everything down that was said, to be a loyal and faithful witness to what has happened. And so you will read the cries, the exclamations that people made, their claim that they knew nothing, that they were going to, in fact, they often said, I'm going to commit a terrible sin, I'm going to lie and confess to something that I've never done. And then, as the torture got worse, they would eventually confess.
Te vas a convertir. No, sé que es un pecador, lo sé que va a confesar. ¿Verdad? Que confesará, ¿verdad?
And here on this table, the pièce de résistance of the Inquisitors' torture weapons. Dreadful things. Pincers for pulling out the fingernails and the toenails. Here, for actually attaching it to the skin and pulling until they rip the flesh away. This dreadful piece of equipment was for ripping off the breasts of women. And goodness only knows what these were for, but if you were shown these, would you not confess? Because I certainly would. This, I suppose, goes without saying. There's one on the door over there. I presume that this was put underneath the chin and you were hung on it. And here, the heretic's fork. This was actually put around the neck. It was pushed into the chin here and here, stuck into the sternum, and then tied around the neck. And then you had to recant the words, abjuro, abjuro, but of course, it's easy for me to do it, but when it's actually sticking through your neck into your tongue, I would think it would have been very difficult.
It made little difference how a person's guilt was established. The fate was the same. It was called purification of sin by fire, a rather gentler way of describing being burned at the stake. There were so many trials and convictions across Spain that the Inquisition couldn't keep pace, a situation soon remedied by mass executions known as auto de fe. These were huge set-piece events that took place in large squares in major cities like Madrid, and they lasted a whole day. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people would come and watch as the condemned were paraded through the city on their way to meet their deaths. Auto de fe were powerful demonstrations of the Inquisition's authority, which also provided a macabre form of public entertainment. Historian Andrew Goff has made a study of these grisly spectacles and exactly what went on.
Auto de fe literally means act of faith, and it is the final step in the Inquisition process. This was a ritual of public penance of condemned heretics that took place when the tribunals determined their punishment, the most severe of which was execution by burning. The largest auto de fe took place in a square much like this one in Madrid, Spain in 1680, when hundreds of men and women were sent to the flames.
For the ordinary Spanish person, an Inquisition auto de fe is a mixture of a really solemn religious event and a really fun mass event. You do bring the children, you do bring your lunch, you bring your friends, you make a day of it. It's enormously entertaining and yet it's religiously educational as well, so you score both ways.
Auto de fe were enormous events, particularly by the time you got to the 17th century. Everybody was expected to come. And the stage took over a month to build. Huge numbers of workmen were employed in it. The costs were enormous. And when you look through the inquisitorial records, one of the things which is also very striking is the amount of money spent on wax. And this is because candles, there are huge numbers of candles all around, so an amazing sense of theatre, majesty, but also an intense feeling of a deeply powerful atmosphere, I think. That was the experience which was involved.
It's deliberately theatrical. The condemned are paraded through the town, dressed in costumes with paintings on that emphasize their particular sin. They're then brought up. There's a whole religious business of praying and preaching. Their sense of wrong is made clear to the crowd, and if they are obstinate, as the people being executed usually are, then the crowd is encouraged to understand this person is going to plunge straight through the fire into hell forever. And then they are expertly burned. And this is an era in which people watch bears and dogs and bulls being tortured to death for fun, in which criminals are killed really slowly for routine crimes like theft, murder. So cruelty is part of theatre, and the Inquisition just cashes into this.
The prisoners were taken to a quemadero, or burning place, which was really just a large wooden pyre. Those who were let off, well, they fell to their knees in thanksgiving. But those who were condemned, they were sent straight to the fire, burnt alive while thousands looked on.
The way in which you could be penanced by the Inquisition was if you confessed. The Inquisition only burnt people at the stake, relaxed them as it was called, to secular justice, if they were seen to be impenitent, if they did not confess. Confession was part of the process of absolution and actually restarting your life. So there was a huge incentive to confess, even if you'd done nothing.
The auto de fes were the most potent symbols of the horrors of the Holy Inquisition in Spain. And the Dominican tribunals kept detailed records of all the public execution, and exactly who was there, who was sent to the flames, and the numbers involved.
This is an actual eyewitness account of an auto de fe in Madrid in 1500. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the procession began with a company of coal merchants, all armed with pikes and muskets. These people furnishing the wood with which the criminals are burnt. They were followed by Dominicans, before whom a white cross was carried. After these came 12 men and women with ropes around their necks and torches in their hands. Next came 20 more criminals of both sexes who had relapsed thrice into their former errors and were condemned to the flames. Those who had given some tokens of repentance were to be strangled before they were burnt. But for the rest, having persisted obstinately in their errors, were to be burnt alive.
To get the Inquisition to put you to death, you really have to work on it by refusing utterly to give up your wrong beliefs. And at the end of that, patiently, professionally, and with infinite goodwill, they'll burn you.
In recent years, a number of historians have reappraised Vatican records and archives. Some have begun to question the established history of the Inquisition and to suggest that time has exaggerated its brutality and the numbers involved. One of these is historian Francisco Bethencourt.
You have, I estimate, 50,000 trials in Portugal, 50,000 trials in Italy, and 200,000 trials in Spain. So we are talking in 3 centuries about 300,000 trials. If you count also with denunciations, you would have at least 5 times that number. In average, people would stay in jail for 1 year while the trials were prepared, while they were interrogated. A minority could be was tortured, but in general, we are talking about long periods of inquiry, long periods of detention. You have an intimidation of population. Population knew all about the Inquisition. It was very visible. So the Inquisition was prosecuting heresy at all levels.
The Inquisition ravaged Spain for hundreds of years, before spreading to Portugal and Mexico, and then inevitably moving to the Spanish colonies in the New World. It was only officially abolished in December 1808 by the Emperor Napoleon after his invasion of Spain. By that time, according to the Vatican's own figures, 32,000 people had been executed throughout the country.
Now, in terms of numbers of dead, that is smaller than I think many people have the idea of. So with the Portuguese Inquisition, we're talking around between 1,000 and 2,000. The Spanish Inquisition, numbers are harder to be certain about because many of the early records have been lost. Many of the inquisitorial records of Spain were burned by Napoleon's troops when they invaded Spain in the early 19th century. So the precise numbers are hard to be certain of, but certainly in that early phase, we're certainly talking no less than 10,000. That is a reasonable estimate.
But all was not rosy in the Catholic garden. While the Holy Inquisition was brutalizing Spain, the English King Henry VIII had decided to break with the Church in Rome and establish one of his own, the Church of England. Henry had previously been a devout Catholic, but the Church had been unable to deliver what he wanted most: a divorce from his Catholic queen, Catherine of Aragon, and marriage to his mistress, Anne Boleyn. To the fury of Pope Clement VII, Rome had lost religious control of England.
To the Pope, Henry VIII's withdrawal of allegiance was a catastrophe. I mean, he is the first king in Europe actually to break with Rome and turn to the new style heresies that have become known as Protestantism. And what's more, Henry aims to be a better Catholic than the Pope, so that's a double insult. It turns people who until now had absolutely no problem in being loyal to the King of England and loyal to the Pope as part of the package into having make a really hard choice. And they are executed as traitors. They're not burned like heretics, they're hanged, drawn and quartered, which is pretty humiliating.
Henry's break with Rome and of course marriage to Anne Boleyn was absolutely abhorred by the Catholic world. And you must remember in those days, in the 1530s, most of the world was still Catholic. And what Henry did was beyond anything. Heresy on a grand scale. The fact that he'd appointed himself head of the church, nobody could cope with it. And of course, to marry Anne Boleyn, to marry twice, and it was too much for everyone. And of course, she was considered a whore. And even worse, of course, she had a child who was considered to be a bastard. And the Catholic Church really weren't happy at this.
What made it really creepy for English Catholics, people more loyal to the Pope in religion than the King, is that the King is behaving atrociously. He's getting rid of a really popular, effective, dignified, pious wife for this unknown with an amazing temper and really dodgy ideas about religion, who's corrupted or bewitched the King and is hurtling England down exactly the wrong path.
Henry's break with Rome and his violent dissolution of the monasteries forced thousands of Catholics, many of whom were from noble families, to practice their faith in secret. Places known as priest holes in which itinerant Catholic preachers could hide were created in many great houses in England.
England is an exceptionally well-run, devout Catholic country. It's not one of the more risky bits of Catholic Christendom. It's incredibly loyal. So the king turns against the Pope. He has to do so, confusingly, not by saying he's embracing a heresy, but that he's getting rid of the Pope in order to protect Catholicism better than the Pope would do. And that really does screw up people's consciences quite badly. A few of them believe him. Even fewer think that they'd actually like to have a heresy, the Protestant ideas, in place of Catholicism, and Henry is the next best thing. Most people are just so stunned because nothing like this has ever happened before. They don't know what to do, and so they do nothing.
When King Henry died in 1547, his 9-year-old son Edward succeeded him to reign as Edward VI. But when Edward himself died suddenly in 1553, aged just 15, his half-sister Mary, the daughter of Queen Catherine of Aragon, eventually came to the throne. Queen Mary Tudor was young, angry, and fiercely Catholic. She quickly set about reversing her father's religious reforms and decreed that Roman Catholicism was once again to be the official religion of England. She ruthlessly pursued Church of England dissenters, executing so many of them that she became known as Bloody Mary.
When Henry VIII died, his feeble, weak son, Protestant son, became Edward VI. He only lived a few years, and then, of course, next in line for the throne, a woman, of course, was Mary I, Bloody Mary. She was a Catholic. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who, of course, had been thrown out by Henry. She was absolutely furious. She was a coiled spring that was waiting for something that she never thought would happen. And all of a sudden, she was queen, a Catholic queen in a Protestant country. And she did everything in the 4 years that she reigned to get rid, to exterminate all of these stinking Protestants that had defiled her faith for so many years while her father and brother were on the throne. And she did a very good job.
Mary Tudor has had the adolescence and early womanhood from hell. She is constantly having to reckon with having been the heir to the throne, regarded with all the awe and the reverence and given all the power of that, to being regarded as a bastard, to being regarded as a slightly better bastard than before, to being regarded as an heir to the throne again, to being regarded as the treacherous sister of the reigning boy King Edward, to being stuck out of the succession altogether and declared a rebel, and seizing England by sheer courageous resistance. She is the only Tudor rebel to succeed since the end of the Wars of the Roses and actually seize London. So, what's she like? She's her father's daughter. Henry VIII is a monumental ego, flattening any opposition, driven by the sense that he is totally right. And that's what Mary is like. She's really brave, she's highly intelligent, she's a superb leader, but she is a fanatic. She's the daughter of an unworldly, unrealistic, unbendably brave woman, Catherine of Aragon, and she combines the lot. If she'd lived for 50 years on the throne, we'd be a Catholic nation today. Instead, she lives for 5 years, but in those 5 years, she burns more people alive for their religion than anybody else in English history, and almost more than anybody else in Europe in the same amount of time.
Mary's reign was really a reign of persecution and recrimination. She wanted to get back at all of those Protestants that had caused the Reformation in the first place, had been against her mother, and basically she did everything in her power to get rid of as many Protestants as possible, including Latimer and Ridley, and of course Cranmer, who was nothing less than the Archbishop of Canterbury. But he was the guy, of course, that organised the divorce of Henry and her mother and the wedding of Henry and Anne Boleyn. So Mary hated him And the poor guy, of course, like so many others, probably 300 Protestant martyrs, burnt at the stake under Mary's reign.
The execution of Archbishop Cranmer was a defining moment for Protestants in England. A pious, devout, and popular man, many people saw his brutal execution as an act of petty revenge by a petulant young queen. And far from rallying people to her Catholic cause, it hardened public opinion against her. Bloody Queen Mary was feared, but she certainly wasn't popular.
Mary, when she seizes the throne, finds, naturally enough, a church which is staffed with Protestants. And she simply lets most of them go. Those who haven't got married and are willing to convert just become Roman Catholic priests. Those that have got married put away their wives and find parishes elsewhere, or else they just leave the profession. And that leaves a hard core of famous Protestant bishops who are put on show trials as heretics and traitors. And she's after about half a dozen of them. The one she's really going for is the Archbishop of Canterbury, the primate of the Church of England, Thomas Cranmer, because he is the guy who declared her father's marriage to her mother invalid and Mary a bastard. And you can see how much she hates this guy's guts, that she actually gets him to declare himself wrong. He declares publicly that Catholicism is the best religion after all. And what you do then is you put this guy on show and gets him to tell everybody that he's wrong. It's the classic propaganda victory. Mary, insanely, insists he still has to die, thereby shattering all the achievement, because Cranmer, when he's actually tied to the stake and is about to be grilled, declares the truth about Protestantism all over again, burns his own hand in front of him, which had signed the denunciation of his former beliefs, and provides the perfect Protestant martyr. It's a classic own goal.
With Europe still reeling from the Holy Inquisition that had now spread all over Europe and into the New World, the events in England had come as something of a shock. No one had imagined that a monarch would stand up to Rome and ban the Catholic faith. But then Henry was no ordinary monarch. In contrast, Mary Tudor's bloody Catholic backlash was more in keeping with the terror sweeping Europe. But what happened next began an entirely new chapter in the history of England. An inexperienced young girl, Henry's daughter, ascended the throne in dangerous and turbulent times. Her reign became known as the Golden Age, but it was also a time of plotting, treason, and treachery. The Elizabethan era was about to begin.
Tudor England was a time of religious turmoil. First we were Catholic, then we were Protestant, then we were Catholic, and again back to Protestant. Thousands of heretics in this country died under the knife, the axe, or in the flames.